Somewhere right now, a government is sitting on billions of stolen files they cannot read. Encrypted emails, classified documents, your bank records, your medical history, your private messages, scooped up off the internet years ago and locked away in digital vaults, waiting for the day the lock finally breaks. And according to Google's own scientists, that day just moved a lot closer than anyone expected. For decades, the entire digital world has rested on a quiet, comforting assumption. Somewhere in the back of every engineer's mind, every bank security team, every government agency protecting state secrets, there was a shared belief that the math protecting our information was simply too hard to break. Not impossible in theory, but practically impossible. The kind of problem that would take a computer longer than the age of the universe to solve. That assumption is the reason you can type your credit card number into a website without thinking twice. It's the reason encrypted messaging apps promise your conversations are private. It's the reason entire economies, entire military communication systems, entire power grids run on digital trust. And for 30 years, that trust has been backed by one simple fact. Breaking modern encryption requires flipping through an almost unimaginable number of possibilities, and no machine on Earth could do it in a useful amount of time. Quantum computers were always the asterisk on that promise. Scientists have known since the 1990s that a sufficiently powerful quantum computer, running a specific piece of math called Shor's algorithm, could tear through the encryption that protects the modern internet. But for just as long, there was a second comforting belief layered on top of the first. Even if quantum computers eventually became powerful enough to pose a threat, that day was always decades away. Researchers loved to say it was 10 years out, then 10 years later, they'd say it again. It became something of a running joke in the security world. Quantum computing was the technology permanently parked on the horizon, never quite arriving, always just close enough to justify funding, never close enough to actually worry about. That joke stopped being funny in the spring of 2026. In late March, Google's quantum AI team, working alongside researchers from a Caltech-born startup called Oratomic, quietly published a set of findings that sent a very different kind of shockwave through the cryptography community. Not the kind of shockwave that makes headlines overnight, because the language was dense, technical, and buried in a blog post most people never saw. But scientists who understood exactly what they were reading knew immediately that something fundamental had shifted. The number of qubits, the basic building blocks of a quantum computer that scientists believed were necessary to break the internet's most common forms of encryption, had just dropped. And it hadn't dropped by a little. It had dropped by an order of magnitude. To understand why that matters, you have to understand what a qubit actually is, and why counting them has always been the measuring stick for how close we are to a real quantum threat. A regular computer, the one in your pocket or on your desk, stores information as bits. Each bit is either a 0 or a 1, a simple switch that's either off or on. A quantum computer uses something stranger. A qubit can exist in a blend of states at once, a property called superposition, and multiple qubits can become linked together in a phenomenon called entanglement. This lets a quantum computer explore a staggering number of possibilities simultaneously, instead of checking them one at a time the way a normal computer would. For certain kinds of math problems, especially the kind used to protect encrypted data, this isn't just faster, it's a completely different category of powerful. For years, the estimate thrown around by serious researchers was that breaking widely used encryption standards like on RSA 2048, the backbone of a huge portion of internet security, would require somewhere in the range of 1 million or more high-quality qubits working together without errors. 1 million qubits sounded so far beyond anything currently achievable that it functioned almost like a safety blanket. Today's most advanced quantum processors, the ones built by Google, IBM, and other major labs, sit in the range of a few hundred qubits. The gap between a few hundred and 1 million felt enormous, insurmountable even, and that gap is exactly what let policymakers, banks, and technology companies push the problem down the road. Then Google and Oratomic published their new numbers. According to their research, a quantum computer with around 500,000 physical qubits, running for just a few minutes, could threaten certain forms of cryptocurrency security. Even more striking, their calculations suggested that with roughly 26,000 qubits, a full day of computation could be enough to break encryption. RSA 2048, long considered one of the gold standards of internet security, could reportedly fall to a machine with around 100,000 qubits given about 10 days to work. These are not small revisions. These are numbers that are 5, 10, sometimes 20 times lower than what experts believed just a couple of years earlier. When you're talking about a technology that grows through steady, incremental hardware improvements, cutting the required threshold by that much doesn't just nudge the timeline forward. It can compress it by years, maybe more. But here's the part of the story that makes this different from every other quantum computing scare that's come and gone over the last decade. This breakthrough didn't happen because someone built a bigger, more powerful quantum chip. It happened because of artificial intelligence. The single biggest obstacle standing between today's fragile, error-prone quantum computers and a truly dangerous, fault-tolerant machine has never really been about raw qubit count. It's been about noise. Quantum systems are almost unbelievably delicate. The tiniest vibration, the faintest stray bit of heat, the slightest electromagnetic interference can knock a qubit out of the precise state it needs to be in, corrupting the calculation. Left unchecked, these errors accumulate so quickly that any computation of real length becomes worthless garbage almost instantly. For a quantum computer to do anything meaningful, let alone something as demanding as cracking encryption, it needs a way to constantly detect and correct these errors in real time, at a scale involving thousands or even millions of qubits working together. This is the problem known in the field as quantum error correction, and for a very long time it was considered one of the hardest unsolved challenges in all of computer science. Correcting quantum errors requires something called a decoder, a system that can look at the patterns of tiny glitches happening across a quantum chip and figure out instantly what went wrong and how to fix it, all without disturbing the fragile quantum state itself. Traditional decoding methods worked, but they were slow, they didn't scale well, and they struggled badly as the number of qubits increased. Many researchers assumed that solving this problem well enough to build a genuinely dangerous quantum computer was still 10, maybe even 20 years away. It was the wall that made all those comforting far future predictions feel safe. Google DeepMind, together with Google's quantum AI division, built something to break through that wall. They called it AlphaQubit, an artificial intelligence system trained specifically to read the noisy, chaotic error patterns produced by a real quantum processor and figure out, far more accurately than any previous method, exactly what had gone wrong. Instead of relying on rigid mathematical rules to hunt for errors, AlphaQubit was trained the way modern AI systems are trained for so many other tasks now. It learned from enormous amounts of simulated data first, absorbing patterns from countless artificial noise scenarios, and then it was fine-tuned using real experimental data pulled directly from Google's own Sycamore quantum processor, learning to recognize the actual messy imperfections of physical hardware, rather than the clean, idealized noise found in a simulation. The results were something close to a turning point. AlphaQubit didn't just nudge past older error correction techniques, it outperformed them by a meaningful margin, and unlike many narrow, single-purpose systems, it showed real signs of scaling. Researchers found that its accuracy held up and even improved as they simulated larger quantum systems, which is exactly the property you need if you ever hope to grow from a few hundred qubits to the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands required for something genuinely powerful. In other words, the very thing that had made the far-off 10 years away prediction feel safe for so long, the assumption that nobody could solve error correction at scale anytime soon, had just been meaningfully undercut by an AI model. This is why so many people inside the field describe what happened in early 2026, not as a single dramatic announcement, but as two separate breakthroughs colliding at exactly the same moment. On one side, AlphaQubit chipped away at the error correction wall that had been holding the entire industry back for years. On the other side, the newer research from Google and Oratomic showed that the actual number of qubits needed to threaten real-world encryption had been overestimated all along, in part because more efficient algorithms were discovered for carrying out the attack. Put those two things together, better error correction thanks to AI, and a lower bar for how many qubits are even needed, and you get a timeline that just collapsed in on itself. Problems that were supposedly decades away suddenly looked like they might be years away instead. It's worth pausing here because this is exactly the point where headlines tend to run wild and where a little bit of caution actually matters. None of this means that someone, somewhere, has already broken into your bank account using a quantum computer. It hasn't happened. Nobody has demonstrated an actual real-world quantum attack against live encryption, protecting real financial data or real communications. What Google published wasn't a working attack. It was closer to a very carefully documented proof, showing mathematically and experimentally that the resources required to eventually carry out such an attack are smaller than previously believed. In fact, Google specifically chose not to release the full technical details of the attack method itself, opting instead for what's known as a zero-knowledge proof, a way of demonstrating that they understand how the attack could work without actually publishing a step-by-step blueprint for anyone to copy. That's a meaningfully responsible way to handle dangerous knowledge, but it also tells you something important. The people who did this work know exactly how serious it is. Today's most advanced quantum computers are still nowhere close to the numbers described in this new research. A few hundred noisy, error-prone qubits is still a long way from tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of stable, error-corrected ones. Anyone telling you the internet is about to collapse next month is exaggerating the story for clicks. But the reason scientists are genuinely uneasy isn't about next month. It's about the shape of the curve. A technology that everyone assumed was crawling slowly toward relevance over several more decades just showed signs of accelerating, and accelerating specifically because artificial intelligence stepped in and solved a problem that raw engineering alone hadn't been able to crack. If AI can meaningfully speed up quantum error correction once, there's no obvious reason it can't keep doing it again and again, each improvement compounding on the last. The compounding effect is precisely what has security experts worried, and it's tied to a threat that sounds almost like something out of a spy novel, except it's very real and it's already happening today. It's called Harvest now, Decrypt Later. The idea is simple and deeply unsettling once you understand it. Encrypted data traveling across the internet right now, private messages, financial transactions, health records, government communications, can be intercepted and stored by anyone with the resources to do it, even if they have no way to read it today. National intelligence agencies around the world have been doing exactly this for years, quietly archiving massive troves of encrypted traffic, betting that someday technology will catch up enough to unlock it all at once. It's a strategy built entirely on patience. You don't need to break the encryption today. You just need to make sure you'll still have the data when you finally can. This is why the shrinking timeline matters so much, even if a functioning, dangerous quantum computer is still years away. Every single day that passes, more sensitive data is being generated, transmitted, and potentially captured by someone willing to wait. Medical records meant to stay private for a lifetime. Legal documents, trade secrets, personal messages between people who never imagined anyone would read them years down the line. If quantum computers capable of breaking that encryption arrive even 5 years sooner than expected, all of that data already sitting in someone's storage right now becomes readable far earlier than anyone had planned for. The clock isn't just ticking towards some future breaking point. It's already running on every piece of encrypted information ever sent. Google clearly understands this, and its response has been telling. For years, the official guidance from bodies like the United States National Institute of Standards and Technology suggested organizations should aim to transition to quantum-resistant encryption methods, often called post-quantum cryptography, by around 2035. That date felt comfortably far away, a problem for future budgets and future engineering teams. But following its own research alongside Oratomic, Google made a striking decision. It moved its internal deadline up dramatically, setting 2029 as the target date to complete its own migration to post-quantum cryptography. In its own words, the company described feeling a responsibility as a pioneer in both quantum computing and the cryptography meant to defend against it, to lead by example and share what it openly called an ambitious timeline, hoping to push the rest of the industry to move with similar urgency, rather than treating the threat as a distant, someday problem. Think about what that actually represents. This is one of the very companies driving quantum computing forward, the same organization publishing research about how much easier these attacks might become, telling the rest of the world, in effect, that 6 years, not 9, is the real window we should be planning around. When the people closest to a technology start moving up their own safety deadlines, that's rarely just cautious optics. It's usually because they've seen something in their own data that makes waiting feel genuinely risky. The ripple effects of this research haven't stayed confined to government agencies and cybersecurity firms either. The cryptocurrency world reacted almost immediately, and for good reason. Bitcoin, Ethereum, and most major blockchain networks rely on the same broad category of cryptographic security that this new research targets. In the days following Google's disclosure, the same findings that had cryptographers on edge were being discussed just as urgently in crypto trading circles. Because if the mathematics protecting digital wallets can be broken with far fewer qubits than anyone assumed, then the security underpinning trillions of dollars in digital assets suddenly looks a lot less permanent than investors had been led to believe. Industry analysts began openly discussing what quantum-resistant upgrades to blockchain infrastructure might look like, and how disruptive that transition could be for networks built, assuming their underlying cryptography was essentially unbreakable for the foreseeable future. It would be easy, at this point, to slide fully into panic, and plenty of headlines have done exactly that. But the more measured, more accurate picture sits somewhere between blind reassurance and doomsday alarm, and that middle ground is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's genuinely more interesting than either extreme. The scientists closest to this work, the ones actually running the experiments, tend to speak in careful conditional language rather than absolute certainty. One of the researchers involved in the Caltech and Oratomic side of this work put it almost exactly that way, describing a fault-tolerant quantum computer capable of these attacks as quite plausible by the end of the decade, while immediately following that statement with a clear acknowledgement that plausible does not mean guaranteed. That's not the language of someone trying to manufacture panic for attention. It's the language of someone who understands both how fast progress has been moving and how many hard engineering problems still remain unsolved. And there genuinely are hard problems left. AlphaQubit represents a major leap forward in identifying errors accurately, but identifying an error and correcting it instantly in real time at the blistering speeds modern quantum hardware operates at are two very different challenges. Some of the physical processes inside these machines run so quickly that even a state-of-the-art AI decoder currently struggles to keep pace with correcting errors as fast as they occur. Scaling any of this up from a few hundred qubits to the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands described in the new research isn't simply a matter of building more of the same hardware. It involves solving new engineering problems that don't fully exist yet at smaller scales, the kind of problems that tend to reveal themselves only once you actually try to build at that size. History has shown again and again, in fields far beyond quantum computing, that the last stretch of scaling any complex technology is often far harder than the breakthroughs that came before it. Even so, dismissing this as just another overhyped tech headline would be its own kind of mistake, because something did genuinely change here, and it's worth being precise about what that something actually is. It isn't that quantum computers suddenly became dangerous overnight. It's that the primary excuse for treating this threat as a distant, someday problem, the belief that meaningful progress on error correction was still decades away, took a real hit. Artificial intelligence didn't just assist with a minor technical detail in this story. It directly attacked one of the central bottlenecks that had defined the entire field's sense of timing for years. And once you accept that AI can meaningfully accelerate a problem that human engineers had been grinding away at for decades, it becomes a lot harder to confidently predict exactly how far away the next milestone really is in quantum computing or in any other advanced technology racing forward with AI as a silent collaborator behind the scenes. That uncertainty, more than any single number of qubits, might be the most important part of this entire story. For most of quantum computing's history, predictions moved slowly and steadily, shaped almost entirely by the pace of physical hardware improvements that researchers understood reasonably well. Now, there's a second force in the mix, one that doesn't necessarily follow the same predictable curve. Nobody fully knows how much further AI-driven approaches like AlphaQubit can push error correction, or how many more previously slow, grinding technical bottlenecks might suddenly give way once a sufficiently capable model is pointed directly at them. That's precisely the kind of uncertainty that keeps security researchers up at night, not because disaster is guaranteed, but because the old comfortable rules for predicting when disaster might arrive no longer apply quite the same way they used to. So where does that leave everyone who isn't a cryptographer, isn't running a quantum lab, and isn't managing a company's security infrastructure? Realistically, this isn't a story that demands you personally do anything differently tomorrow morning. Your passwords still work. Your bank is still secure. The encryption protecting your messages today is not about to fail this week, this month, or most likely even this year. But it is a story worth understanding because it marks a meaningful shift in how seriously the organizations responsible for protecting global digital infrastructure are now treating a threat that used to feel comfortably theoretical. Banks, governments, and major technology companies are the ones who need to move, and increasingly they are. Google's decision to pull its own internal migration deadline forward by roughly 6 years is a genuine signal, not a marketing stunt. Other major institutions are almost certainly having very similar conversations internally right now, weighing exactly how much runway they actually have left and whether the number they'd been comfortably planning around still holds up. It's also worth remembering just how young modern encryption actually is, because that context makes the speed of this shift feel even more striking. RSA encryption, the system so many of these new calculations are built around, was introduced back in 1977, a product of an era when computers filled entire rooms, and the idea of carrying a device in your pocket capable of billions of calculations per second would have sounded like science fiction. For nearly 50 years, RSA and systems like it have quietly done their job in the background of daily life, largely unquestioned, largely unnoticed, simply working. Most people who use encrypted apps every single day have never once thought about the math underneath because they've never had to. That invisible reliability is exactly what makes a sudden shift in the threat timeline feel so disorienting to the people who understand it. It's not that the foundation was ever perfect. It's that everyone assumed there would be decades of warning before it needed replacing, and that assumption is precisely what's now being tested. Inside the security industry, the reaction to this research has been a mix of validation and unease, sometimes from the very same people in the very same breath. Cryptographers who have spent years advocating for a faster transition to post-quantum standards, often facing pushback from organizations reluctant to spend money and engineering time on a threat that felt comfortably distant, suddenly found themselves with hard evidence supporting exactly what they'd been warning about. There's a strange kind of vindication in that, being right about a threat nobody wanted to prioritize. But it's vindication wrapped in genuine concern because being right about this particular threat doesn't feel like winning an argument. It feels like watching a slow-moving problem get less slow in real time. Some skeptical voices in quantum computing, the ones who spent years pushing back against inflated hype and premature panic, are now among those taking this research the most seriously, precisely because it didn't come from marketing materials or investor pitches. It came from peer-reviewed calculations, and a company that has every financial incentive to downplay, rather than dramatize, a threat to the digital infrastructure it depends on. None of this means individual people need to overhaul their digital habits overnight, but it does raise a genuinely useful question worth sitting with. What data are you creating today that you'd still care about someone reading in 10 or 15 years? For most everyday browsing, the honest answer is probably not much. But for sensitive medical information, confidential business communications, long-term financial records, or anything meant to stay private for the rest of a lifetime, that harvest now, Decrypt Later threat stops feeling quite so abstract. The organizations responsible for protecting that kind of data are the ones under real pressure to act now, well before any quantum computer capable of the attack actually exists, because by the time the threat is fully realized, it will already be too late to protect information that was captured years earlier. There's also a broader lesson tucked inside this particular story, one that reaches well beyond quantum computers and cryptography altogether. For years, artificial intelligence has been framed mostly as a tool for writing text, generating images, or answering questions faster than a person could look them up. This is a very different kind of demonstration. This is AI being pointed directly at one of the hardest, most technically demanding unsolved problems in physical science, and meaningfully moving the needle on something human researchers had been stuck on for years. If that pattern holds in other fields, materials science, drug discovery, energy systems, the kinds of breakthroughs we've been comfortably telling ourselves are decades away might, in more than one case, turn out to be considerably closer than anyone currently expects. For now, the encryption protecting the internet hasn't broken. Nobody has pulled off a real quantum attack against real-world data, and no one credible is claiming otherwise. But the wall that made this threat feel safely distant just got noticeably thinner, thanks to an artificial intelligence system trained to solve a problem that had stumped human engineers for years. Google is racing to move its own defenses years ahead of schedule. Cryptocurrency markets are quietly recalculating what unbreakable actually means. And somewhere out there, in servers belonging to governments and intelligence agencies most of us will never see, all that stolen, encrypted data keeps waiting patiently for the day the lock finally gives way. The only real question left is not whether that day is coming. It's how many years sooner than expected it might actually arrive.